In the spring of 1979, in a hospital room in Flagstaff, Arizona, a retired engineer named Raymond Aldridge was dying. His wife sat beside him. His 2 adult children stood near the window. The room was quiet. The machines were doing what machines do in those rooms, and the family was doing what families do. Waiting, holding on, saying the small things that feel enormous when you know they might be the last ones. And then, in the final hours before he drifted away for the last time, Raymond said something that none of them had expected, something that once spoken could not be unsaid. He told them he had been in contact with non-human beings he called the Greys, since 1953. 26 years of silence. And the part that none of them could explain afterward, the part that stayed with his daughter Clara long after everything else faded, was that when he said it, he seemed relieved. Not frightened, not confused, relieved. Like a man who had been carrying something very heavy across a very long distance and had finally been allowed to set it down. I want to start not with Raymond the man, but with the moment, the night it began, the night that, based on what his family would later piece together from scattered fragments, a journal notation here, a telephone record there, a single line in a letter to his brother that no one had thought to read carefully until after the confession, appears to have been sometime in early May of 1953. Raymond was 32 years old. He was working as a junior signals engineer at a contractor facility outside White Sands, New Mexico. His family says he never fully described the nature of the work, even at the end of his life. That night, according to what he told his wife Eleanor in those final hospital hours, Raymond was driving back along a desert highway from a late shift when his vehicle simply stopped. Not gradually, not a slow engine cough and a drift toward the shoulder. Stopped, engine off, lights out, dashboard completely dead. He later described it as the silence that follows a crack of thunder. Total, immediate, and wrong in a way that his engineering mind registered before the rest of him caught up. He sat in that darkness for what he believed was several minutes. Then the light came. He said it came from above and slightly ahead of the car, and he said it was unlike any light source his technical background had prepared him for. It did not cast shadows the way light is supposed to. Objects beside the road appeared illuminated on all sides at the same moment. He looked down at his own hands resting in his lap, and noticed that neither hand cast a shadow under the other. That specific detail, that almost clinical observation from a man trained to notice how things behave, is the kind of detail that tends to stay with you once you have heard it. It is not the kind of detail a person invents. It is the kind of detail a person remembers. He stepped out of the car. He told Eleanor he did not decide to. He said his body simply moved, and that is where the account becomes genuinely difficult to process in ordinary rational terms. Standing in the road, Raymond says he encountered 2 figures, not 1, 2. He described them consistently in the deathbed conversation, and apparently, according to his daughter Clara, in at least 2 prior conversations, she had overheard through a closed study door at different points over the years without ever understanding the context of what she was hearing. Roughly 4 feet in height, proportioned in a way that he said struck him as deliberate rather than natural. Large heads, eyes that were dark and appeared to him as somehow patient, no visible movement of any mouth, no audible sound of any kind. And yet communication, clear, purposeful, structured communication arriving inside him the way a hand leaves a mark pressed into soft clay. Not spoken, not heard. Pressed. His son Marcus, who I have spoken with at length, says the word Raymond used consistently in that final conversation was impression. Not thought, not voice, impression. The encounter on that desert highway lasted, by Raymond's own estimate, somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours. He could not be certain. His watch had stopped. When the car restarted on its own without him touching anything and he drove back to his rented room, it was past 3 in the morning. He had left the facility just before 10 the previous evening. His daughter located his time records later in a box of personal documents, and the math left a gap of over 5 hours. Raymond believed he had been outside for less than 2. Those missing hours sit in the account the way a word sits on the tip of a tongue. You know something is there, you cannot reach it. Here is what the available evidence, fragmentary and imperfect as it is, suggests happened in the weeks and months that followed that night. Raymond did not go home and try to forget. He did not file the experience away under unexplained but irrelevant, which is what most practical, technically trained people do when something disrupts the orderly system of their world. Instead, over the following months, he began to disappear briefly and quietly. His landlady at the time, a woman named Mrs. Vargas, whose family his son Marcus later tracked down in the mid-1990s, remembered Raymond returning on several mornings that summer looking, in her words, like a man who had run a long way through the dark and could not tell you where he had been or why. 3 unexplained absences in a roughly 4-month window from a man who, by every account of his colleagues at the facility, was the most chronologically disciplined person in the building. 3 absences prove nothing. I am aware of that. But The deeper you go into the timeline Raymond's family reconstructed across 2 decades of quiet, methodical investigation, the more these individual data points cluster together in ways that become harder to explain as coincidence. And clusters in any serious investigation are the thing you cannot afford to wave away. By 1955, Raymond had moved to a new city and taken a position at a private electronics company. According to company records his son Marcus obtained through a public records filing in 2001, his work there involved the design and maintenance of low-frequency signal receivers. Receivers calibrated to bandwidth ranges that, in the mid-1950s, had almost no civilian applications. When Marcus asked the company, by then absorbed into a larger defense contractor, for more specific technical documentation from that period, he was told the records had been archived off-site. Not destroyed, not lost, archived off-site. There's an important difference between an absence and a silence. An absence is something that was never there. A silence is something that was there and then was deliberately made unreachable. That archived documentation is a silence, and silences of that particular bureaucratic texture, technically worded, politely final, difficult to argue with because there's nothing to argue against, tend to gather around things that someone somewhere decided should not be easy to find. What was Raymond doing with low-frequency signal receivers in 1955? His family does not know, but they know this. In a storage unit his wife Eleanor maintained until her own death in the early 1990s, there were 3 handmade electronic components that no one in the family could identify. In the early 2000s, Clara brought photographs of 2 of them to an electrical engineering professor at a university in northern Arizona. The professor examined the images carefully and said the components appeared to be some kind of receivers, but that the specific configuration was unusual and that he could not identify what bandwidth range they had been designed to operate in. He asked where they had come from. Clara told him. He did not follow up. Not unusual, not unrecognizable, not unlike anything he had seen before. Specifically configured in a way he could not categorize. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Raymond, by every account from people who knew him, was not an emotionally expressive man. His son Marcus describes him as warm but self-contained. Clara uses the word structured, even in the deathbed confession, a moment charged with the kind of raw urgency that strips most people down to their most basic vocabulary. Raymond spoke about the contacts with what his family describes as professional precision, almost taxonomic, which is what makes certain specific fragments of his account so striking. At some point during the contacts, and based on scattered diary notations, the family believes these occurred at irregular intervals throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. Raymond says the beings communicated something to him that he spent decades attempting to translate into ordinary human conceptual language. He described it in his final hours as a layered message, not one idea but several delivered at the same moment, the way a musical chord is not a single note but multiple notes arriving together. He said they communicated something about time, not time as human beings measure it, not clocks or calendars or the orderly sequence of before and after. Time as a property of something closer to attention or awareness. He said they seemed to suggest, or impress upon him, that from their perspective, the gap between their first contact with him and any future contact was not experienced as duration. That they did not wait, that waiting was a concept tied to linear time perception, and that their relationship to time was something else entirely, something he struggled his entire remaining life to find adequate words for. He eventually settled on a single word. He called it adjacency, not before and after, adjacent, all moments sitting beside each other rather than following one after another in a line. I have turned that word over many times since Marcus first shared it with me. What does it mean for a being to experience all moments as adjacent rather than sequential? What does it mean for contact to feel ongoing, not because it is repeatedly started from scratch, but because, from a certain kind of perspective, it never fully ended? Does that reframe what Raymond was describing? Not as a series of separate encounters spread across 26 years, but as something more like a sustained condition, a state of contact rather than a chain of events? His family says Raymond seemed to believe the communication was not always initiated from the other side. He was emphatic about this point even as his health declined. He seemed to believe that over the years he had learned something about how to be in a state of receptiveness, not how to call them, not how to signal, how to be still in a particular way that allowed the impressions to arrive. He had, in other words, developed something that resembled a practice. Between the mid-1960s and the mid-1970s, the family records go quiet, not empty. Raymond was present. He was working, raising his children, living his life, but quiet in the specific sense that matters here. No unusual absences that Clara can recall, no early morning returns that any neighbor mentioned later, nothing unexplained turning up in storage units from that period. Does that silence mean the contacts stopped during those years? Or does it mean he had by then learned to integrate them so completely into the texture of his ordinary days that they left no outward mark anyone else could read? Eleanor, speaking to Clara in the early 1980s after Raymond's death but before her own, said that during the late 1960s, Raymond had gone through a period of what she described simply as deep calm. Not happiness in an ordinary sense, not contentment in the way the word is usually meant. Calm. She said it was like living alongside someone who had solved a problem they had no way of explaining to you. She said it sometimes quietly frightened her. She said she would sometimes come downstairs late at night and find him sitting at the kitchen table. Not reading, not eating, not doing anything she could name. Just sitting there, eyes open, somewhere else entirely. Where did he go during those kitchen table silences? What was arriving in those still hours? In the dark of an ordinary house, in an ordinary neighborhood, while his family slept above him, and the rest of the world continued on without any knowledge of what was happening inside that quiet man? A colleague from the electronics company, a man named Thomas Harwell, who worked alongside Raymond from 1955 to 1961, and whom Marcus located through a professional directory in the 1990s, said in a written letter that Raymond had over their years together occasionally made remarks that Harwell described as off the map. Not alarming, not irrational, just off the map. He recalled one instance specifically, a lunch break in the summer of 1958. Raymond looked out a window at the desert landscape and said quietly, almost to himself, as though thinking out loud rather than speaking to anyone, "They don't think of this place as remote, you know. They think of it as a meeting point." Harwell said he had laughed, assuming it was a dry joke. Raymond had not laughed. He had looked at Harwell for a steady moment and then picked up his lunch and said nothing more. That single moment, that small, unremarkable-sounding exchange on an ordinary afternoon, does not prove anything. But once you have read it in Harwell's own careful handwriting, you carry it differently than you did before you read it. Raymond's deathbed account, as reported by Eleanor and later reconstructed by Clara and Marcus through their conversations with each other, included not only descriptions of the beings and the nature of the contact, but also specific fragments of what had been impressed upon him over the years. He said the beings communicated something about human memory, about how it works not as a fixed recording of past events, but as something closer to active construction. He said they seemed to indicate that in any given moment, human beings are not accessing the past as it actually was, but are building a version of it that serves the needs of the present moment. He found this distressing, apparently, not because it was frightening in an obvious way, because it suggested that the shared history of human experience might be, in their view, less fixed and permanent than we experience it to be. He said they communicated something about other points of contact, not only with him, not only in New Mexico. He described an impression of a distributed pattern, contacts occurring across multiple locations with multiple individuals, across multiple stretches of time, as though the beings were engaged in some long and patient project. He did not know what the project was. He said he had the sense they did not expect him to understand the whole of it, only his portion of it. He said they communicated something about the specific area of New Mexico where his career had first placed him. He said he came to believe, over the years, that the original encounter had not been accidental, that something about his particular work, the signals, the specific frequencies he had been engaged with professionally, had made him in some way he could not articulate detectable to them. Detectable. That word carries an important implication. It implies that prior to the night in 1953, he was not yet on their radar, that his technical work produced some kind of signature, some frequency or output that drew their attention in a way that would not have happened otherwise. And if that is true, even as a question worth asking rather than a conclusion worth drawing, then the question of how many other engineers working with similar frequencies in similar facilities across the American Southwest during that same period were equally detectable becomes very pressing indeed. And how many of them said nothing? And how many are still saying nothing from inside whatever silence they chose? I want to be precise about something. Raymond's family did not, for the most part, disbelieve him. That was the first thing that struck me when I began looking carefully into this account. The easy assumption would be that a dying man, perhaps confused, perhaps affected by medication, said something extraordinary that his family gently attributed to the distortions of the final hours and moved on. But that is not what happened. Clara and Marcus both describe a man who was in those final hours more mentally clear and precise than they had seen him in weeks. Who chose every word carefully? Who, when Clara asked him directly whether he was certain of what he was telling them, looked at her and said he had been certain of very few things across his life, but he was certain of this. Marcus spent the better part of the following 2 decades quietly investigating. Not publicly, not at conferences. He was an accountant, but he wrote careful letters to archives. He filed records requests. He drove twice to the area near White Sands. He tracked down Thomas Harwell and Mrs. Vargas's family and the engineering professor in northern Arizona. He assembled a file, methodical and thorough, that now runs to several hundred pages. He has not published it. He shared portions of it with me. He's reluctant to make it public, he says, not because he doubts his father, but because he worries that the moment this account enters the broader public conversation about unexplained contact, the particular details, the light that did not cast shadows, the word adjacency, the kitchen table silences, the archived off-site documentation, lose their weight and their texture beneath the accumulated noise of every other story ever told about beings from somewhere else. He might be right about that. There's a category of evidence that investigators rarely discuss because it resists quantification. I think of it as the evidence of character. Raymond Aldridge was not, by any account that survives him, a man given to fantasy. He did not read science fiction. He showed no documented interest in the subject of unexplained contact either before or after the initial encounter. His bookshelves, according to Clara, held engineering references, several volumes of history, a set of general encyclopedias, and a collection of jazz records. His correspondence, what exists of it, addressed practical matters, work, family, finances. The occasional quiet reflection on getting older or on faith. He was not primed for this kind of story. He did not arrive at it through a culture of belief or community of like-minded people. He arrived at it, apparently, through a Tuesday evening on a desert highway that disrupted the otherwise orderly trajectory of a precise and careful technical mind. And that disruption, that single inexplicable event in the spring of 1953, appears to have become the organizing center of the rest of his inner life. Carried completely alone for 26 years, released only when there was nothing left to protect, and no more time to keep the silence. I am not here to tell you that Raymond Aldridge communicated with non-human beings across 26 years of desert silences and kitchen table stillness. I am not prepared to tell you that what he described is real, that the beings he called the Greys exist, that they have been conducting a long, distributed project of contact with specific human individuals selected somehow by the frequencies of their professional work. I am not prepared to say any of that, but I am not prepared to dismiss it either. Because the shape of what Raymond's family assembled across 2 decades of patient, private investigation does not look like the shape of a lie. It looks like the shape of a secret. And secrets and lies, though they share a surface resemblance, have entirely different structures underneath. Lies tend to be smooth, sealed, internally consistent in a performed kind of way. Secrets tend to be jagged and uneven, leaking at the edges in unexpected places, maintained across years at a visible personal cost. Raymond paid a cost. His family paid a cost they did not even know they were paying until the moment he finally spoke. What did the beings learn from Raymond Aldridge across 26 years of impressions and adjacency and those late-night kitchen table silences? If the contacts were real, what was his portion of whatever the larger project was? If his professional work with specific signal frequencies made him detectable, how many others working with similar frequencies in similar facilities across the Southwest during the same period were equally visible to whatever it is that was looking? Of those others, how many made their confession in the end? How many took it with them? What is still sitting in cardboard boxes and storage units somewhere, in archived off-site files that are technically retrievable but practically not? In the quiet memories of children who overheard fragments of conversations through closed study doors and never understood what they were hearing until it was too late to ask? What was the project? What was Raymond's portion of it? And somewhere in whatever constitutes their experience of time in that strange condition of adjacency, where before and after collapse into something that does not translate cleanly into human language, are they, in some sense, still in contact with the man who stepped out of a car on a desert highway on a spring night in 1953 and stood in a light that fell on both sides of his hands at once and cast no shadow anywhere? I do not know. I'm not sure anyone is supposed to know yet. But the questions do not close. They sit there, patient and open, the way all the most important questions do.